Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unfortunate Archives. Today's video is only made possible because of Katie Colson's incredible work. She watched more than 700 YouTubers talk about their favorite books of 2023 and she made a list of the books that were mentioned the most number of times. If you haven't watched that video, go check it out. I will link it somewhere on the screen or down below. The amount of effort that she's put into it is astonishing, like seriously astonishing. For today's video, I read the top 10 books of the list. For each one, I'll give you a brief synopsis and I'll tell you my thoughts on it. And at the end, we can have a chat about what these 10 books had in common that made them so popular. Book number 10 is Project Hail Mary. In Project Hail Mary, this dude wakes up completely alone with no memories on a freaking spaceship in space. He has no idea who he is or why he was sent there. He also doesn't know who the two dead bodies on the spaceship are, which isn't creepy at all. But he has a feeling that something's gone terribly wrong on Earth and that he's meant to do something about it. So we follow him as his memories slowly come back and he begins to unravel why he was sent on this mission and what he's supposed to do. This book grabbed me from the very first sentence and it did not let go until the very last. I actually listened to this on audio and I highly recommend that for reasons that are slightly spoilery, but it's a lot of fun. And I was listening to this as I was exercising, as I was eating, as I was meant to be sleeping. I was not sleeping. Like, I stayed up to listen to this book, which I never do. If you've read or watched The Martian by the same author, this book has a very similar vibe because they're both really puzzle-solving books in space. Like, if you like escape rooms, I feel like you'd like both of these books. They both also feature very similar main characters who are very optimistic go-getters despite horrific odds, who are white dudes with incredible intelligence, who are still relatable. They're just regular people. They're just like you and me. But they are going to attempt to save all of humanity. So, you get the kind of character I'm talking about. So in that way, this book is very American. That was me attempting to do an American accent. I don't know what I'm doing. But by American, I mean the US, and by very American, I mean whenever we meet characters who aren't from the US, they're so incredibly stereotypical. You'd think it was ironic, but I don't think it is. Like, genuinely, the first time we meet these characters, we have a German dude yelling, we have a Japanese man speaking in a quiet and distinguished voice, and we have a bunch of Russian people going crazy over vodka. Like, I'm not even kidding. Like, no exaggeration required. So that wasn't my favorite aspect of the book, and I did find the overall tone a little too happy for my taste. Like, I genuinely wanted him to spiral more about this terrible situation that he was in, maybe a breakdown or two, But I still love this book. I had so much fun reading it and I absolutely do recommend it, even for or especially for people who don't usually read a lot of sci-fi, because this just makes such an approachable segue into the genre. Book number 9 is None of This Is True. In None of This Is True, two women meet in a bar when they're celebrating their 45th birthday. One of them, Alex, is a very successful podcast producer, and the other one, Josie, is married to a man 30 years her senior. Josie convinces Alex to make a podcast about her life, which she claims is very interesting. Though I'd say most people would call it traumatic. However, as the story continues, it becomes very clear that Josie has this weird obsession with Alex, and also that she might not be telling us the entire truth. So this book actually has 3 layers. The first one is that a Netflix documentary is being made about this now notorious podcast, which was associated with multiple murders. The second layer is the podcast itself, which we read in transcripts. And the third and main layer is the story of these 2 women and the events that happened as they were making this podcast. I was very much not the audience for this book. I don't like true crime podcasts and I don't like or read that many thrillers, but I thought, maybe this would be one of those books I could enjoy regardless of my usual reading tastes. That wasn't the case. Don't get me wrong, it's not a bad book and I really enjoyed listening to this one on audio as well because of the full cast and the sound effects and the podcast aspect. It made for a great listening experience, but the story itself was just fine. It was fine. I wasn't particularly invested. And at no point was I really shocked, which for a thriller was a bit of a disappointment. I guess the biggest draw of this book is Josie's character and this idea of obsession, but I didn't feel like the book said anything new or insightful about either of these things. It wasn't a particularly in-depth psychological analysis of a character, and it just didn't have anything to say about obsession or relationships between women or anything like that. It was just things are happening. This book also dealt with subjects like grooming and pedophilia, but I didn't feel like these were always handled in the best way, and that also left a bad taste in my mouth. So all in all, this one was a bit of a disappointment. Book number 8 is Tress of the Emerald Sea. Tress of the Emerald Sea follows Tress, this girl who lives on a small island, except in her world, seas are made out of deadly spores, and they're deadly because they react violently to the smallest bit of water in ways that often gets people killed, deadly. So that means that an island isn't exactly an idyllic holiday destination or a great place to live, but Tress doesn't mind. She's lived there her whole life and she's in love with the Duke's son, Charlie. And for all she knows, she plans to stay there the rest of her life. However, Charlie ends up having to leave the island and gets kidnapped, and of course, Tress decides that she's going to leave her home for the first time and set off on a rescue mission across the deadly seas. I was so surprised that this book made the list because it's kind of an unusual one. But I guess that also makes sense because it means there isn't a lot of books like it out there and apparently people want this. The reason I'm saying this is because this is a fairy tale for adults. And this isn't a new concept, but usually when we talk about grown-up fairy tales, we're talking about twisted and violent ones, which are my favorite. But this isn't that at all. This is a pretty upbeat adventure story, except in tone and narration style and plot, it has a lot of fairy tale elements, and it's written for an adult audience. The closest books I can think that have a similar vibe are Stardust by Neil Gaiman and The Princess Bride, which was in fact an inspiration for this book. And also, like any good fairy tale book, it has gorgeous, gorgeous illustrations. So I'm really sad I don't have a physical copy to show you, but I'll put some on the screen for you to see. I actually didn't read this book for this video. I'd read it before for myself and I enjoyed it as a whole. It's fun, it's cute, and the world building is as unique as you'd expect from Brandon Sanderson. Also, if you are a Sanderson fan, you'd probably enjoy the little nods to the broader Cosmere universe. But if you're not, don't worry about that. It doesn't impact the story at all and you'd understand everything perfectly fine. All that being said, I wasn't that invested in the story. I was just like, you go girl! But if you don't go girl, I'm gonna be fine as well. And maybe that was because of the more distant fairy tale style of narration, or maybe it was because I just know what I like in adult fairy tales, and that's blood. Book number 7 is Carrie Soto is Back. Carrie Soto is Back follows Carrie Soto, who used to be the biggest tennis player in the world before she retired. Like, she literally held every single record in the tennis world. However, when this book starts, she is now in her late 30s and she's watching a new hotshot player beat her record. When this happens, she decides to come out of retirement and take it back, except she's trying to break her way into a professional field where she was once considered a legend, but now she's considered kind of a embarrassment, and she's trying to do it despite being at an age which for an athlete is considered way past her prime. Carrie is a super competitive, very ambitious person, and she's not particularly agreeable, which makes her such a great character to read. She faces a lot of sexism in the sports industry and across journalism. Big surprises there. But she's also facing her own self-doubts and perfectionistic tendencies, as well as an aging body that she often feels is betraying her. Those aspects of the book were quite fascinating to read. There's also a very close father-daughter bond at the heart of this story, which gives it more of that, I guess, emotional stake. For me, this book didn't have the punch that Daisy Jones and the Six and Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo did, but it was still super enjoyable and engaging. It made me feel like I cared about tennis way more than I do. And there are some rudimentary Spanish sentences that I understood, and that made me feel real good. So I would recommend this book. I recommend it for anyone who likes character-led stories and who likes the idea of sports memoirs but is disappointed by the reality of them. This is the real deal because it's fictional. Book number 6 is Love Theoretically. Love Theoretically follows Elsie, a chronic people pleaser and a struggling theoretical physicist, as she falls in love with this experimental physicist who apparently hates the entire field of theoretical physics and also happens to be the only person who can see through Elsie to her real self. I've talked about this book before, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on it, but this is just a solid romance novel. I think the reason that it resonates so much with readers is because Elsie is such a people pleaser, and I can see how that would make the right type of reader feel very seen. She also has diabetes, so bonus points for the representation. And Ali Hazelwood is generally good at writing banter, even though she takes it a bit too far into millennial quirkiness. My favorite part of the book was actually its depiction of academia and toxic mentorships, and specifically of a character who is struggling so hard to reach any sort of stability as an academic, which made me feel real good and not at all panicky about my life choices. Yeah. But outside of that, I wasn't particularly passionate about this book. So, take that as you will. Book number 5 is The 7-Year Slip. The 7-Year Slip follows Clementine as she's moving into her aunt's apartment after her passing. Her aunt used to tell her that this apartment was magical and it could transport you 7 years in time, but Clementine never believed her. Of course, after she moves in, it becomes abundantly clear that this was in fact true, and Clementine ends up meeting and falling in love with this boy who used to live in the apartment 7 years in the past. I should say man, boy sounds wrong. When Clementine finds this man in the present timeline, she finds that he's changed quite a lot in the past 7 years, and that really makes her doubt whether their connection can endure across time and whether they can have a real relationship. This book did what very few romance books have ever done. It made me feel genuinely sad. And I really like that. We got off to a rocky start because the writing at the beginning is a bit clunky, and it definitely didn't help that Clementine mentioned on every sentence how absolutely brimming with stamps her passport was and how it would put any other travelers to shame. Like, it's genuinely insane to me how many times she mentioned this in the book. I love to travel too, but I try my best not to mention it in every other sentence. I found that rule in the guidebook on how not to be a smug but maybe Clementine didn't get her copy. Whatever. You might think that I sound a little bitter and potentially jealous, and you'd be absolutely right. However, after I got past that, I was surprised by how much I enjoyed this book. It actually reminded me a lot of Emily Henry's books because of the way that even though they're romances, they don't shy away from more serious issues. And the romance isn't the only or even the most important thing that's happening in the character's life. So in this one, for example, the book really doesn't shy away from Clementine's grief, and that made it super touching. That being said, this isn't for you if you're looking for a purely feel-good romance. In fact, it feels almost more like a contemporary book with a very big romance subplot and a magical twist. In line with that, Clementine and Evan actually don't share as many pages together as you often see in romance books, but when they are on the page together, they have a lot of chemistry and I like their dynamic. That being said, the amount of love and devotion that they have for each other after spending a very short amount of time together is more unrealistic than the time-traveling apartment, especially on Evan's side. However, I like them, so I chose to turn a blind eye to that. I would recommend this book if you like romance, but not too much of it. And if you just like a super bingeable contemporary book with romantic flavors. And yes, Evan is a chef, so that was a pun. I didn't claim it was a good pun, but it certainly was a pun. Book number 4 is Yours Truly. This book follows Brianna, who is a hotshot ER doctor, except her life isn't going so well at the moment. She recently divorced her husband after he cheated on her with her friend, and her brother's been diagnosed with sudden onset kidney disease and they can't find a match for him. On top of all of that, when Jacob, a new ER doctor, starts in their hospital, he seems super rude and standoffish, and Brianna just doesn't have time for it. However, after they have an altercation, Jacob writes Brianna a letter explaining that he has severe social anxiety, and when Brianna writes back, they soon become really good friends, which then turns into a fake dating situation. Why? Because Jacob has to prove to his family that he's fine with his little brother marrying his ex. Are you with me? If you're confused, that's fine, because Jacob and Brianna are also soon confused about what's real and what's fake in their little relationship. What stood out to me the most in this book, and why I think it's appealed to so many readers as well, is the representation of Jacob's anxiety and how the book handled this with so much compassion and really showed how Brianna really understands him and how this brings them closer together. This was also a very slow burn book with minimal amount of smut, which is how I like it. And I tend to usually really like romances that include more serious issues. And this book does a little bit in the beginning with the kidney disease and the anxiety. But very quickly, this turns into pure fluff, only for there to be a massive tonal shift at the very end of the book. Like, so massive that I got whiplash. When we suddenly go from cutesy confessions and incredibly unrealistic fake dating situations to historical trauma. And I was just left confused. Both of these aspects of the book, like the unrealistic romance and the trauma, were well written, but they just weren't integrated. It felt so odd, like you were reading bits of different books with the same character just smashed together. So even though I enjoyed reading this, when I finished this, I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Like, I think a problem is that once you start introducing that kind of realism at the end of the book, it makes the reader question the rest of the premise. Like, I was suddenly thinking, oh my god, they only know each other for a few months. Isn't this a bit too intense? Should they be living together? Isn't this a bit obsessive and codependent? And that's not how you want to be feeling at the end of a book, you know? Especially not at the end of a romance book. So yeah, a bit conflicting at the end. I think I initially gave it 4 stars, and then I went back and edited it down to 3.5 because I was just like, this is how I felt. Book number 3 is Yellowface. Yellowface follows June, this white and failing author. That's a weird sentence. And it starts when June's friend, who is a literary star, dies in a freak accident by choking on some pancakes. So June finds her friend's finished and unpublished manuscript and ends up publishing it under a slightly more ethnically ambiguous version of her own name. Did I not mention that her friend was Chinese American and that the book follows an all Chinese cast? No? Well, that complicates things, doesn't it? The book ends up hitting the bestseller list, but soon people are asking all these questions about whether June had any right to tell a story like that, and also whether she actually wrote the book. But she didn't. I've talked about this book before as well, so I won't go into it so much, but I absolutely adore this book. This is one of those books that strikes the perfect balance between being both incredibly intelligent and very thought-provoking, while also remaining very bingeable and just super fun to read. It's about cultural appropriation. It's about this idea of who has the right to tell what stories and why. And it's about racism in the publishing industry. So I'm not at all surprised that this made the list, because it has so many nods to the literary community that it makes perfect sense why booktubers would love this book. However, I think anyone would enjoy this book if they like slightly bizarre scenarios and have a really good dry sense of humor. Book number 2 is Happy Place. In Happy Place, we meet this old friend group who's been taking an annual holiday together to the same vacation house for years. However, this year, without anyone knowing, 2 of them, who happen to be a perfect couple, Harriet and Vin, have broken up. So Harriet was the only one who was meant to come to this year's vacation and tell everyone. However, despite their plans, they both end up coming, and once they're there, they find that this is actually the last year they can come to this place. So to avoid ruining all their friends' holiday, they decide to pretend to be a couple just for a few days. How hard can it be? We're exes. We can convince the people who know us best that we're still a couple, can't we? So yes, this is another fake dating scenario, except this time it's between exes, which is an interesting twist and also a unique form of torture, if you ask my opinion, but you know, to each their own. An Emily Henry book so high up on the list. What a surprise. What an absolute surprise. So yeah, I too, like most readers, really like Emily Henry, and this book has characters who go through internal upheavals and question their career choices and relationship patterns, which I view as the hallmarks of an Emily Henry's romance. However, this was actually my least favorite Emily Henry book, which is the opposite to a lot of readers who I saw say this is their favorite. The reason I saw people give for why they like this book so much was because how it focuses on this idea of how hard it is to maintain friendships when you leave college and you don't see your friends all the time anymore, and in fact you might only be seeing them once a year, which seems like an idea that I would be super interested in, given that I live on a different continent to almost all of my very close friends.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
However, I was a bit disappointed by this aspect of the book because I just didn't see a lot of this friendship that was meant to be so central to the story. Like, it didn't feel like they were such close friends. That could be because, like, the book is showing us that they're not really as close or they don't share as much. But I also didn't buy that they were that close in the past, so it was hard to be invested in their friendship. I also wanted just a more memorable leading man because he was super bland, and ideally I wanted not to have forgotten everything about this book and all of its characters less than 2 weeks after reading it, but you know, we can't always get all we want. Now, I also need to mention that this book was slightly triggering for me because it follows a character who has spent a lot of time to reach this career, only now to be questioning whether it's for her or not. So that bit was, you know, not so fun for me to read, but I really don't think it was why I was disappointed by this book. I just thought I'd mention it in the spirit of full transparency. Before I announce book number 1, I'll let you have a guess. Yeah. If you follow any sort of book social media like BookTok, Booktube, Bookstagram, then you know. Number 1 is Story. I feel almost ridiculous giving a synopsis of this book given how mind-bogglingly massive it was last year, but I'm going to. Fourth Wing follows Violet, this young girl who has trained to become a scribe her whole life, only for her very scary and very famous general of a mother to turn to her and say, oops, surprise, you actually have to go join the Dragon Riders, despite the fact that they have the highest mortality rate of anyone in the army. I mean, talk about maternal affection. Also, did I mention that Violet has a chronic disease, which means that her joints dislocate constantly? What could go wrong? Not only does Violet have to fight people who've trained their entire lives to join the Dragon Riders, she also happens to meet this incredibly attractive and very powerful Dragon Rider who seems to hate her on sight and in fact might be trying to kill her to take revenge for his dad, who her mom executed. Now, the most important thing I want to tell you about this book is that it's not good. It's not good, but the second thing I want to tell you is that it's a lot of fun. Let me explain. This book takes all of your favorite nostalgic YA tropes and it repackages them into this neat little adult romantasy. I repeat, romantasy. This isn't fantasy with original world building and intricate politics. If you go in expecting that, which I think some people did, you'll be so disappointed. This book is extremely tropey. Like, it's literally as if Divergent had a baby with the Red Queen and Sarah J. Maas was the godmother, and then the baby grew up and started having sex with this super attractive man. Like, that's what this book is. That's part of its appeal. That's why it feels so comforting and familiar, because we've read and loved books like this before as a teenager, and it makes us feel the way we did then as adults. And who doesn't want that, you know? But that also means that from the world building to the plot to the characters, there's nothing original about this book. It's all been done before. It's a give and take with tropes, you know? That's just a bargain. Now, is the world building in this book completely inconsistent? Yeah. Is the plot fully predictable? Yes. Do characters change their whole attitudes and beliefs from one page to the another just to increase drama and tension? Yeah. Is the romance a little cringe? Did I go to work on 3 hours of sleep because I had to stay up and finish the first part of this book? Yes, absolutely yes. And honestly, I would do it again. I had so much fun, especially in the first half of this book. I couldn't set it down. I don't care. This book is absolutely not going to mentally challenge you or blow your mind. And that's fine. It's not trying to do those things. It's just pure wish fulfillment, escapist fun. And it does an amazing job at that. So it's a good book in that sense. Also, it includes dragons, and we all know dragons always make everything better. So there's that. I'm not at all surprised that this book is popular and on this list. Was I surprised at how popular it was last year? Yes, but to be fair, I think everyone was. It was just one of those weird things. And I don't think this book will have massive staying power, but who knows? Regardless, we'll remember this as Booktubes and probably all of book social media's #1 book of 2023. So, this is the full list of Booktubers' most recommended and favorite books of 2023. I did lie to you a little bit because Project Hail Mary was actually book number 11, and Part of Your Word, which is another book by the author of Yours Truly, was in fact book number 10. But I felt like the list had enough romances on it, and I really wanted to read Project Hail Mary. So, that was a bit of a trickery on my part. Just for fun, I also rearranged this book based on Goodreads ratings. Fourth Wing is still #1 on this list, and Yellowface is the lowest rated on Goodreads, which I'm not surprised by, because it discusses the most controversial topics out of any book on this list, and that always tends to divide opinions. So just don't judge this book by its rating, unless you're a little racist. Then you probably won't like this, Not that anyone who doesn't like this is racist, but I don't think any racist will like this book. Now, because I know you care so much about my opinion beyond the opinion of millions and millions of readers, this is the list rearranged in my order. The last 4 books, I probably wouldn't read again if I went back in time. Fourth Wing is #6 because it's not a good book, but I don't regret reading it in the slightest. Books number 4 and 5 I thought were good books, and both were somewhat unique in their respective genres, but they weren't my personal favorites. And the first 3 books were the books that I thought were genuinely great books and I really enjoyed, with Yellowface being the only one that I would consider a personal favorite. So what do these 10 books have in common that made them so popular with booktubers and the general reading community alike? So the first thing is, these are all very happy books, but they don't shy away from discussing more serious topics. These books include topics like anxiety, depression, grief, suicide, racism, sexism, and even Fourth Wing centers a character that deals with a chronic illness, which you'd consider a more serious topic. However, they're all happy in different ways, whether it's through a general optimistic tone and outlook, happy endings, or just very funny and humorous writing. None of these books are gonna leave you emotionally devastated, which might also be why I didn't have a lot of favorites in this list, because emotional devastation is something that I actively seek out in books, but I can appreciate that many people don't. And I think these happier books that still aren't without substance appeal to a lot of readers. The second thing these books had in common was that a lot of them included familiar tropes or premises, but added their own little twist to it. So when you take a book like The 7-Year Slip, you can see that time travel and romance aren't an unfamiliar combination, but usually in this case the conflict is that one character is stuck in time. However, this book chose instead to explore the themes of how we change across time and how to maintain a relationship. You really need to fall in love with different versions of a person, which isn't usually what you find in time travel romances. Or Project Hail Mary, we have so many books where a character is in space, and we have so many books where a character wakes up with no memories, but you combine these two things and you get a book that feels both familiar and fresh. Even Fourth Wing is, in a way, a twist just by the sheer number of tropes that it includes and potentially the fact that it includes dragons. That one might be a bit of a reach, but I maintain that this balance between freshness and familiarity is another thing that these 10 books have in common. The third and biggest thing these books had in common was the absolute bingeability of them. All of the books on this list created that sense of, I can't put it down, I can't put it down, which, created an interesting week for me as I was reading them. It's maybe not surprising to see that all the 10 books that were considered the top 10 of the year were books that created that real sense of urgency and felt very easy to read. I would say that the majority of people, like 90% of the people who pick up any of these books are going to finish it. Whether they like it or not might be different, but they will finish them. So those are the three things these books had in common. Collectively, the books on this list were picked 444 times as people's favorite books of 2023, which is an insane number. However, keep in mind that this comes from more than 700 videos of people picking 10 or more books. So that's 7,000 books, which makes this 6% of all of Booktubers' favorite or most recommended books of last year. So while a list like this is a super cool way of seeing books that resonated with a lot of readers, we're still missing a lot of data. So if none of these books appeal to you, don't despair. I believe, I know your perfect book match is out there. And I feel a sense of personal responsibility to help you find it. So like and subscribe for book recommendations and more bookish content. And I'll see you real soon. Bye-bye! I'm severely allergic to all sports that require hand-eye coordination. It's a real thing. Many people suffer from it. In fact, many of them might be readers as well, who knows, Might be a direct correlation. Okay. It's you, but okay. And I just,